I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
I'm Blake Howard.
He's back. They got him back. They did
better
it
than ever.
again. He's here. This is Oeuvre Busters. Boom.
I feel like you're getting more and more confident saying the title of our podcast.
I took a French class so I could pronounce oeuvre improperly. I could do it.
All these French philosophers are so pretentious.
Oh, they're the worst.
Sending Liam all this hate mail.
Yeah. I get letters from Sartre. Is it Sartre? Sartre?
Well, I mean, he's dead if you're getting letters from Sartre, but I was thinking about maybe
from beyond the grave.
Alain Badiou.
Don't throw your knowledge of philosophers at me. Is that the guy who wrote?
Everybody knows Alain Badiou. He's a fucking household name.
I know. I have that book.
So George, I think the challenge is for you to write in dead French philosopher hate mail to Liam and read it out on the show, like about his pronunciation and just about his character. I think of both.
Like in general,
both good.
I think that's a good idea.
Sounds like a great project.
George, reference a not dead white philosopher challenge, please. Let's see if we can do that. Blake, we're so happy to have you back to the show. Welcome back.
Thank you, lads.
How's things going?
Yeah, going really well. In Oz, there's only one state, which is our southern state in Victoria, which still has sort of pretty heavy coronavirus, COVID-19 sort of restrictions. In my state, it's pretty good.
Good.
It's slowing down. It would be nicer if people actually wore a mask.
Is that a problem there?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, look, and it's also weird, like suburbs to suburbs as well. You know, my local suburb, I go into the Woolies, our little local supermarket there, and there's always lots of people wearing masks and stuff, and so people are keeping pretty safe, which is cool. And then we went into this other place. My wife was like, I'm getting sick of our current shops that we go to, so let's just go somewhere different for, a novelty of something. And we went there, and it was just a whole lot of old people, none of them wearing masks. I'm like, oh, cool. So everyone's going to be dead here soon. Like, we're going to be shopping like the people in Dawn.
Not just because they're old.
Not just because they're old, because none of them were wearing masks. I'm like, cool. This shopping center's real estate is going to be like primo, right? Like, so
you should invest now.
Invest now in a seat in that cafeteria, because a lot of these people aren't going to be here next summer. But it's a horrible garbage fire of year 2020, and I think both of us / all three of us, both of our shows, but all three of us have found solace in creating and having a dialogue with great pieces of art and great filmmakers, and so literally that is what's kept me going, is an unquenchable thirst to continue to produce things that basically bring people joy and distraction.
Well, the good news is that there's no garbage fires in the United States that we have to put out. Everything's going great. There's definitely encroaching fascism isn't encroaching. Maybe already your fascism isn't a huge problem. Well, very, very quickly, we should intro you to the folks who, if they did not hear you on the show before or in the 4,000 podcasts you produced this week. Blake Howard is a writer, film critic, podcast host, and producer behind One Heat Minute Productions, which includes One Heat Minute, The Last 12 Minutes of the Mohegans, Increment Vice, All the President's Minutes, Miami Nice, and Josie and the Podcats. Almost said podcasts. Josie and the Podcats.
Nailed it.
I nailed it. Endorsed featuring legendary filmmaker Michael Mann. Let us all bow down to Dad. One Heat Minute was named by New York Magazine and Vulture as one of 100 great podcasts to listen to and nominated for an Australian Podcast Award. Creator of the Australian film collective Graffiti with Punctuation, Blake is a Rotten Tomatoes approved film critic with bylines in Empire Magazine, SBS Movies, Vague Visages. How about Visage? No, I can't say anything in French. I did it. Dark Horizons.
Liam, you have failed me again.
Film Link, and many more. Blake, if you ever need us to record your bio, just let us know. We'll be sure
I'm taking this clip. I'm going to rip it straight out of this show.
We have a lot to talk about, but the one thing that I wanted to just mention beforehand is
Blake's
I
awesome
thought of
beard.
you. I thought, the amazing beard that's going on. That's the core beard. But when I found out that when I read Bill Gayabiri's piece on Michael Mann shooting Tokyo Vice and having to come home, and when they were shooting that and had to start production, I bought that book and read it in one day, and I just was like sitting there fantasizing about the film that hopefully we will get. soon from Mann himself.
Oh, look.
The series.
Yeah, look, it's exciting. Whenever you hear that Michael Mann's working on something, it you know that it's going to be like it's a sign of end times, because he worked on Miami Vice, and then there was Hurricane Katrina, and now there's the COVID-19 pandemic for Tokyo Vice. I mean, it just feels like the world wants to stop us from more great Michael Mann things, but when he can pursue and break through, there's always going to be. I can just say to anyone listening, there will always be someone who has read every single article about anything that, if you have a Michael Mann Google alert, as I do, and also a Google alert for all of his movies, then you will make sure that you'll find out what's up with Mr. Mann. He's undeniably my favorite filmmaker.
He's
What's
the
up
greatest.
with Mr. Man sounds like the name of another great podcast.
It's about Michael Mann. It's better than our mansplaining.
It's
podcast
podcasters
idea.
walking around stalking Michael Mann, trying to figure out what's up with him.
So, speaking of Michael Mann, do you guys think Michael Mann likes Akira Kurosawa, who is the subject of this week's podcast? He has to be a fan, right? Michael Mann is a fan of Akira Kurosawa.
Yeah, I would say he loves John Ford. Mann loves John Ford, so I wouldn't put it past him. There's actually a great list, and I'll just while
we'll vamp.
Great podcast hosts can sort of vamp and Google while they're doing this at the same time. But Michael Mann's top 10 movies, one of them is like My Darling Clementine, which is the Ford Wyatt Earp love story. The rendition of that sort of love story version of that tale, and he does have sort of spectacular formal taste when it comes to classics. He loves The Passion of Joan of Arc. Funnily enough,
it's one of my favorites.
Funnily enough, he loves Inarritu's Beautiful is one of his favorite films of all time. He loves Apocalypse Now. He loves Battleship Potemkin. He also loves, get this, Avatar. I don't know if he's trolling. He loves Avatar.
I could see that.
He loves Citizen Kane. My Darling Clementine, as I said, Passion of Joan of Arc, Raging Bull, Doctor Strangelove. So The Wild Bunch. So this is this is a guy who has that sort of formal taste, and Kurosawa, loves John Ford explicitly and implicitly. So I think he'd be a guy who would appreciate and love this movie for sure.
And George, what movie are we talking about?
Liam, we are talking about The Seven Samurai from the magical year 1954. So The Seven Samurai begins with a village of farmers being threatened by a group of bandits. The bandits decide not to raid the village, even though they have the opportunity to do as such, since they raided it rather recently. So they hold off. Their plan, however, is overheard by a farmer who is hiding in the brush. Farmers then quickly decide that they have to hire some samurai to protect the village, but they have no money to offer them. So the village elder suggests that they find some hungry samurai. Eventually, they find one by the name of Kanbei, who is Takashi Shimura's character, an older and wiser warrior who begins to help them recruit the other 6 samurai that they need to protect the village. The important ones, I guess, of the bunch are Katsuhiro, who's the youngest one, and who falls in love with Shino, who is the daughter of one of the farmers. There's Kyuzo, who's the stoic and cold-blooded swordsman, and Mifune's character, who is Kikuchiyo, who is kind of like the wild card, mercurial one, the badass, so to speak, the Han Solo of the bunch, if you will. Second half of the film is a slow boil as the samurai prepare to defend the village. We're taking through a whole number of preparations, how they plan on fortifying the village. The film slowly builds up to a final cataclysmic battle between the samurai, the villagers, and the bandits, with a number of smaller skirmishes throughout. At the end of the film, samurai and the villagers kill the bandits, but they lose 4 of their comrades, including Mifune. The film ends with the remaining samurai Kanbei, Katsuhiro, and Shichihiroji, walking out of town, looking at the burial mound where their friends are, and it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory, and Kanbei says that in the end, we lost this battle too. The victory belongs to the peasants, not to us. Roll credits.
Yeah, the action epic, super important, great movie. I want to just give one note that I think is an interesting way to start our conversation, which I read reading Stuart Galbraith's book, The Emperor and the Wolf, is that Kurosawa was almost replaced making this movie because he went so over budget and he was so incredibly demanding. And when they made him take a break, he came back and he was even more demanding.
Amazing.
But there was apparently he was really concerned that he would be replaced because there was a film director who was going to be the potential replacement, who was extremely conservative and incredibly anti-union, and was involved in sort of crushing the unionization attempts at Toho in the 40s. And he was really worried that this person wouldn't be as sensitive to the class dynamics that were going on in the film, which I thought would be an interesting thing for us to explore. Blake, what do you think of this movie?
Oh, it's a flat-out masterpiece. It's fingerprints. Its fingerprints are in so many movies, but also so many movies have tried to do what this did and bludgeoned the nuance to death.
Yeah.
They took the wider concepts, and people are going to say Magnificent Seven and those sorts of things. They're going to play around with those, whether it's the remake or the original. And I'd like to even point to something like 13 Assassins, which I think is like a great sister movie to this movie, which is essentially just like a supersized, contemporary Seven Samurai. But that is way less concerned with class issues and politics and the despondency of falling empires and falling structures of society, and is way more interested in lopping off the limbs of poor concubines who then have to paint like vengeance with a paintbrush in their mouth. I actually took my wife to that movie, and she looked at me and was like, "What is this?" And
you were like, "I'm a catch. I'm a catch."
I'm like, I don't know. I thought it was going to be a samurai movie in the ilk of the Seven Samurai. I wasn't expecting it to be this violent and vulgar right off the bat. But yeah, I think it is incredibly hard approaching this film. And you guys asked me to do this one, and I was like completely blown away. So thank you for the honor. But it's incredibly hard, like doing the research, because like in my hands right now, I'm literally holding, Roger Ebert's great movies piece about it. I've got the Criterion booklet, which also has the incredible Ken Turin, who wrote a piece about it. And also, Pauline Kael's I Lost It at the Movies, which has her, this is the great artist of film criticism writing about this movie. So it's like almost impossible to say more than they've said. But I think if I could, I just want to read.
Please.
I just want to read a little paragraph from Pauline Kael's review. So she says, "It bears a resemblance to the Hollywood Western, the beauty of the Western genre in its formalization and stylization, the clarity and simplicity of the action and motives. Although The Seven Samurai is brilliantly complex visually, although it can be interpreted in terms of such complex themes as the problems of honor, the meaning of human cooperation, the interlaced responsibilities of defenders and defended, it preserves the chivalric simplicity of the Western plot, which is even more wonderful in the nuclear age. 7 hired knights defend a village against 40 mounted bandits. Their pay a few handfuls of rice. Everyone knows what the fighting is about, who the marauders are, who the protectors are, and who the particular piece of land where they battle will be joined." That in my mind is exactly what, you don't get much better than Pauline Kael, but that's what I get is there are strange relationships going on. And I would just even add and expand to like mentors, mentees, and leaders, and the people that they're leading, and also having heaped the responsibility just for that sort of mercenary, like, I need to be fed, so I'm doing a job. So also my morality is going to be curbed because the need for what you guys are giving me is so profound. There's just so much that's going on in this movie that it does it very, it's almost like a symphony. It's happening in the background. It's not, the foreground can be the action and the motives that are this great clarity, but it's almost like it's enriched in this tapestry of all these other emotions and conflicts. And so there are central conflicts which can be really easily distilled. 7 verse 40, simple, save poor people. But I think what gets me every time is just looking at the expanse of the frame, looking at in that 40 quality of looking at all the different characters' faces and trying to figure out what they're emotionally going through. And yeah, I don't know. This is a movie. In my current office, you boys are seeing it. I can twist my screen around, so I work on the opposite side of the desk. So behind me is my screen, which is where I will watch things, and I can regularly have Seven Samurai just on with nothing on. I'll be doing work and just nothing on, just because I just want to see that world. I just want to peek in, and I think that a lot of people have tried to, do the Aliens version of this in any appropriation of the text. They want to make it bigger and more bombastic, and they always miss the emotion. And for me, I think if you just turn off the noise, what really makes this one of the greatest movies of all time is how deeply you feel the plight of these people and the solidarity of going up against shitbag marauders.
Amen. Well said. I think really quickly to add to your point about everything happening in the foreground and the background, one of the things that I read when I was reading about the film is that Kurosawa made the peasants all live together for like the entire shoot, and the whole shoot was a year.
Speaking of demanding, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, and like, they were at night, they were like going back to the hotel and all getting drunk together. And like, he was a famous drinker. And so they were just like in each other's business all the time. And it's demanding and exacting, but you're right. It comes through in every frame of this movie. George, what do you think?
Yeah, this film rocks.
Yeah, that's all I want. Let's move into this movie. Fucking rules.
The mic and walk away.
It rules. It's so goddamn good.
It's just I think what we'll talk about, or at least kind of what I'm curious to talk about or interested in talk about, is again, and Blake said some of this, but about how, aside from just the uniqueness and the glory of the film itself, about how influential it is. So we recently did an episode on the Dirty Dozen. And while I was watching this, I was like, oh my God, this film, there would be no Dirty Dozen without a film like this.
Not at all. There's no Wild Bunch without this film.
Yeah, and to just think about how influential, again, this film is, it's monumental. And again, yeah, just being in that world, and also some of this, especially the last 20 minutes of this film and the epic scope of it and where it builds, and that final set piece and the rain and the final battle, it's just so...
It rules.
Yeah, it rules. And
it fucking rules.
And to think it was being done, in the 50s, you're like, holy shit. So when you said that this film went over budget, you definitely feel it and you definitely see it.
Way over budget.
Yeah.
To your point there, I want to jump ahead. There's a lot of things that I saw this film for the first time in high school at the first cinephilic event I ever attended. It blew my mind. It changed my brain forever. And I've probably watched it. It's probably the Kurosawa film I've seen more than any other Kurosawa film, because I've known it for the longest amount of time. So upwards of 7, 8, 10 times. I've seen it in the theater a few times. George, in the notes, you made a comment about how the battle sequences are all these smaller set pieces that they unfold. And I thought that'd be an interesting thing to think about, because not to draw an obvious parallel, but there is truly no epic battle in this movie. And it draws an interesting distinction between there's no Marvel movies without Seven Samurai. I also don't think so. There's no Avengers. But what's so amazing about this movie is that the battle sequences will always, to me, rock more than any of these giant green screen saturated, movies that we see out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for a couple reasons. One is it's Kurosawa, and two, because everything is practical.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're brought back to that Kurosawa not only didn't have the means because those things didn't exist, but that it's all about framing, and it's all about composition, and it's all about shooting multiple cameras at the same time. It's the first time he was doing that, and editing at night so he could see what he was getting. It's such a practical, lived in, visceral kind of movie. And I think that we sometimes action films, not among the three minds assembled here, but sometimes people are dismissive of action movies, and I think that every movie is an action movie, and this is such a good action movie because it's rooted in a momentum defined by a very clear expectation, as you said, Blake, 7 versus 40, and we know that this thing is coming, and I just think it's so archetypally perfect, and I don't know what else to say about that the frame of it, except that it is, to me, a perfect movie. Even when it feels in the beginning, you're like, okay, the beginning is so iconic, maybe the first 40 minutes, but like the second that we get back into that village, it's just like, it's like eating a really good steak or something. It's just so good. And it feels different than any of his other films to me. It's a really different movie.
The one thing I want to tack in with what George said, that's the mastery of great action set pieces in battles that a lot of those larger than life, wildly orchestrated, huge battle sequences forget, is that each of them are their own great tales, usually conflicts between small groups, whether it's 1 or 2 people fighting 10 or whatever. It's like, and it's actually finding ways to tell it. And even in big bombastic sort of Lord of the Rings things, it's like there is a big battle going on, but all of the actual mounting conflicts to those things are like, well, here's Legolas, taking down an elephant or whatever the hell it is. Not the Timothy, but the thing, whatever it is. Here's Gimli.
It might have been Timothy.
It might have been Timothy. We've heard if you've ever seen him interviewed about acting, you might think that. But, those sorts of things. But I love that. I much prefer. I don't need colossal stakes. And this is in all movies that I think grow too big for their boots. Everything goes too wild. Whereas some people are like, hey, I want to see a car driving from building to building in Dubai and Fast and the Furious. I'm like, you know what I really liked? When 3 cars surrounded a truck in the first one. I'm fine.
Yeah.
Like, I'm good. Look at that. It's a real car. It's a real truck. They're driving real fast, and there's some cool like practical camera moves. Or it sounds like it's made up, but it's like that's why the Mad Max Fury Road had such an impact colossally on action cinema. It was like because most of these guys should be dead because George Miller had them launched from exploding vehicles and giant, these kind of giant like pole vaults that would fly off into the distance and things like that. But that's why people go back to that movie endless amount of times. Obviously, it was digitally fixed on the edges, but the essence of the urgency of the action is there, and I think that's what Kurosawa lays out. It's like, I don't want to just see 7 against 40. I want to see people running through a town, have a physical landscape, have these little battles where one guy looks like he does have the upper hand against 5, and then 5 have the upper hand against 1. And it's like, these are mini dramatic Titanic moments that all happen along the way.
Yeah, it's like, it's analog and... Yeah, I'm just floored by this. I can't really. I just finished watching it about 3 minutes before we recorded, and like I literally had to finish it and be like, okay, here we go, let's do it. One thing that stuck out to me this time, and I don't think this is something I would have thought about, but in light of our present conversation about like who holds power, this movie has a lot to say about who holds power, where power resides, the sort of class dynamics. There's that scene at the beginning that is like a set piece unto itself where there's what are called coolies, but are the day laborers versus the peasants versus the samurai, and the kind of like the coolie saying something like, oh, thank God I wasn't born a peasant, or whatever the case is. I think that stuff resonates through the whole movie. But I want to jump into this moment towards the end of part 1 as a jumping off point where Keio, played by the man Toshiro Mifune, shows up dressed as a samurai.
Yes,
and they're all horrified by it. And Kanbei, played by Takashi Shimura, has this line where he says, "You can't understand unless you've been hunted." And there's sort of a takedown by Keio of both the peasants, but then the samurai class. And it brought up a lot of really interesting questions, at least in the US, and I'm sure something that's resonant everywhere, is the question of like, who's responsible for the behavior of these samurai? Who's responsible for the behavior of these peasants? And like, how much can these peasants trust these samurai? Like, I've never really thought of them as, in the watching of this movie, and it's been a long time since I've seen it, as kind of the bad guys, or potentially kind of at the end of the era that they're living, a kind of regressive, oppressive, reactionary force in the culture. And I was wondering, I mean, if any of that resonated with you, Blake.
Yeah, it's a deeply complex issue, and it's weird because we don't really have a contemporary contemporary parallel. Like the only thing I can think of is like, imagine if there was still militia forces at the end of like the Civil War or like colonial forces that just like that were kind of affiliated with the law but not, just bombing around your suburb. And if you piss them off, you might die. You know, and if they come into your town, you best feed them. You best give them what they want, and you best offer up your ladies, because that they're essentially, you're going to just have to treat them like they're a kind of occupying force. And this kind of revolving occupying force of samurai, they're almost semi-marauders themselves, except that there's this like tenuous law affiliation. And at the time that we're watching the movie, or at least the way that I interpret it, it's like they're no longer part of this sort of really clear factional classes and the samurai who know, go for each of these different land, barons that are around the country. They're kind of just now, some of them are baronless, leaderless, and then they just go off and do their thing. So yeah, it's really interesting because, I don't think it's wrong to right from the outset say, they're definitely not necessarily good guys. They're good by their actions. And that's what's good about them. But it's inherently, are they good? Maybe not. And are people exploiting the fact that they can dress up like samurai when they're not technically samurai to get these benefits? Sure. Yeah, they are. That's kind of one of the things that happens in this movie.
It feels really prescient to right now, George. I don't know. I watched this and then jumped on Twitter for a second and saw the footage of these militias in Louisville.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
Well, no, yeah, like Blake's right. I mean, there's no exact parallel, but I mean, it does sound, they are kind of like, cops in a certain sense.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like, to some degree, kind of authorized to do whatever it is that they need to do to survive. But yeah, this group seems to, again, be like directionless, kind of not beholden to any certain specific kind of authority. But there is this kind of, this like ominous quality to them, which again, you get with one of the subplots where the daughter Shino is kind of, her hair is cut off, so she looks more like a boy. So that way, obviously, she doesn't draw the attention of the samurai. Yes. So it has like a lot of really interesting things also to say about gender. But also going back to that scene that you mentioned, Liam, about like the class dynamics, which again, I think are really interesting, is that Mifune's character, right, is the son of a farmer. And that comes up, and also like that he gains that armor, he finds that samurai equipment from the villagers, right, who have taken it from like fallen warriors or from people who have left it behind in battles.
They chased down some samurais and murdered them.
And that's where obviously like his kind of critique, the Mifune's critique in that scene comes like, the peasants like, they're not as innocent as they seem to be. And that's like one of the first kind of inklings you get that they are in fact also to some degree like duplicitous, that they are also like cynical. They're also kind of looking out for themselves. So yeah, I mean, the class dynamics of this are interesting. And again, you could see it in a variety of ways. It's like nuanced for sure, but it also seems to be an example of Kurosawa's cynicism and pessimism about the human condition. So that even when these samurai are there to help these poor farmers, these poor peasants, and they are also exploited in turn by them.
Yeah.
It kind of almost reminds me of that episode of The Simpsons where they go to Springfield to make Radioactive Man, the movie.
I love that episode. It's so good.
And then they're chastised at the end by Mickey Rooney. He's like, these poor innocent Hollywood folk just came to your town to make a movie, and you exploited them horribly. It's
maybe the first step in real time where that parallel has been drawn. No one has ever had that conversation before. It's pretty impressive.
It's a great fucking episode.
That's a great pull. And for any Australians who are listening to this show now, they know how deeply those Simpsons pulls from those early seasons resonate. But yeah, look, I agree. It's the lie of American society, is that there's not a really complex class system going. Whether it's both derived from racial or social or economic stuff. It's like, we're just America, and it's like, it's a big lie. And in a lot of texts, whether it's, speaking from the colonies, in a lot of British texts and Commonwealth texts, and there are class distinctions, and Australia has bought into its own lie that we're this classless society. Yeah. Okay. And look, you guys do you, right? Like most of the rest of this country, you just keep doing you. But it's down racial lines. It's down, it's down lines of it's generational divides too. And so for me, when I look at when I look at this movie, I love the naked classism. I love that it's just there. And it's great to be able to examine it, because it's like the beauty of Kurosawa's films, I think, and what moves you, and it's like the same with Ozu films as well, is that you're watching a completely different culture that has completely different dynamics and completely different history, yet things can so deeply resonate with you. You're just like, yeah, that's you know, that could be me. That could be my poor family coming and migrating to this country, or it could be my poor family who did migrate to this country and weren't that well off because a lot of the sons and fathers went to war and some of them died and most of them came back either drunks or, you know, completely fucked up. You know, it's like you can start to draw the parallels of your own life and see really deeply into that. And so that's what I kind of like looking at it, is because what's sad is that it still resonates so deeply, but it's what's good is that why it sort of lasts is because it does at the same time.
You know, there's something interesting to that, especially when you think about this moment, which, you know, I mean, I think every time you watch this movie, you get something new. That's what makes it really amazing. But the scene where Kikichio picks up the baby and freezes, and Shimura is like, "What's wrong?" And he says, "This baby is me. This is exactly what happened to me." And it makes you think about larger questions of like the quote unquote like calamity of history, and like historical forces clashing, especially in Japan at this time, which is such like an era shaping and changing event in the culture. It feels like there's an attempt here to kind of say something about the horrors of like Japanese history, which I don't think would resonate when you see that. When I saw this film when I was 15, for example, you know. Goes beyond that. You know, one interesting thing that I thought in terms of, you mentioned, George, you mentioned that Kikichio's sort of straddled this world between, he's like a fake samurai who's the son of farmers. But one thing, I'm wondering if this resonated with you guys. Did you guys notice the sort of attempt to kind of mirror Kikichio's behavior with Katsushiro's? So Kikichio is the sort of the kind of rebellious, he's Mifune. He's the rebel. It's like one of the most iconic performances. Katsushiro is played by Isao Kimura, who's the younger kind of samurai. And it seems as though Kikichio has a kind of watches the way Katsushiro relates to people and wants to be what he describes. When he's envious of the heroic samurai, Kikichio tries to do that. He tries to steal a rifle. And it feels to me that there's an attempt to draw a parallel in Kurosawa between like the eager guy and the jaded, but really just as naive kind of character. Did you guys get any of that?
I've always thought that they're kind of like different destinies of the same desires. Like where it's like, you know, Kikuchio's, he's modeled his entire life from all of these mentors who've lived this sort of sacred warrior existence, and he wants to see that. But there's also, in that rigidity, I guess, is that envy of and that desire, and maybe that sort of that fantasy of what freedom is like. And what's cool about Mifune's Katsushiro is that he's just like, he's id, like he's just doing whatever he wants to do, and he's unburdened by his morality or his history or his customs. Like he'll wear the armor and he doesn't care what it means. Whereas I think Kikichio's like, this means that I've trained for X amount of years of my life and sacrificed all this time, and you're just pulling it off a dead guy and wearing it, and you get to be like me. And so I think I think they've got a great relationship. I think it's fun to think about. I think that's a great reading. I don't think you're necessarily wrong. I haven't quite put those together. I've always thought of them though as there's the same inkling. There's the same thing that they would.
Yeah, maybe it's that.
They would like that. They would like that destiny. They'd like to be heroes. But I think Katsushiro has always thought he's just never going to be a hero. He's just may as well be may as well just pillage.
Kikichio, you mean Kikichio has never wanted to be a hero. Mifune,
yeah,
right.
Yes,
yeah. One of the things that made me think of this, and it only occurred to me after the fact, is that in Stray Dog, Mifune's character is sort of placed in as the sort of responsible cop, is placed sort of in contrast as a mirror to Yusa. the criminal who he's hunting down,
Yes.
who's also played by the same actor, Isao Kimura.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's like an incredible... I didn't know it, but it's like an incredible kind of oeuvre-spanning thing that he uses these two characters in opposition to one another. And it really resonated with me watching the film, because I was like, oh, this guy has been in a Kurosawa movie before. And I went back and I was like, holy shit, he's played Yusei. So it's really, really interesting. I'm continually struck by Mifune in this movie. You know, I was this week, I was reading some stuff, including we had A.S. Hammer on the show, and he was sort of talking about how he thinks Mifune's kind of hams it up in this movie a little bit. And then I was reading Galbraith's book, and Galbraith's book is like, he's amazing. Yeah. I think that this has got to be one of the most like indelible, important performances in film history.
Yeah, there's a couple of male performances that happen around this time that I think of, and he's right on the line. Like there's a classicism about what he's doing, so they're still keeping with, it's just before sort of, I guess you would break through and call like modern understandings of performance, but it's on the line. It's like he's not quite Brando in On the Waterfront, because Brando's all the way there. But I would say his kinship is Montgomery Clift in A Place in the Sun is a great one, because he's like doing some business, but it's on the modern spectrum. So I think that's where Mifune is great, because they want to play like, there's no way in Kurosawa's fastidious preparation of this movie that he's not like, I want you to be big. He's intending in those moments, when he's big, he wants you to be big. But it's the same criticism, and to go back to my favorite film of all time, Heat, that they give like Pacino. It's like, when is he actually being big is the question that I want to ask people who say that Mifune is like putting it on. He's putting it on because he's showing his bluster. He's trying to scare the peasants. He's trying to show how tough he is to the samurai. And it's actually then you just take the moments where he stops all of the literally being a performative person.
Like performative, yeah.
In character being performative. That's where you get the windows into like, oh, actually, no, this may be one of the best performances that has ever been committed to celluloid.
Yeah, some of the best moments of him acting are like the cutaway scenes where like the rest of them, for example, shit on him.
Yeah.
And the camera cuts to him and he's like scratching his head or just kind of rubbing his neck, and he kind of looks uncomfortable, and he's kind of, realizing that he's being called out and he feels bad about it. And again, it's this moment where he inhabits this dual nature where clearly he is to some extent on the top of the food chain or close to it, especially in relation to the peasants. But in regards to the rest of them, he's very much kind of a poser, and he's still very much trying to prove himself constantly to them. Like, it's also really fascinating in a Freudian way that he has this massive fucking sword that he walks around with, and he doesn't really, doesn't keep it by his side. It's like always over his shoulder, or he's wielding it around. And it's clearly a really fucking powerful phallic symbol, but it also shows how insecure he is in many respects.
Well, back then they didn't have Ferraris to drive into.
Yeah, exactly.
They had big fucking swords.
Give me the biggest sword you have, please.
I will say my favorite part in the whole thing is when he sees a woman from across the room and he turns to Shimura and he says, "She's got a great ass." That's my favorite. That's my favorite part of it's a really good scene.
Please, someone on the internet, please, someone badly subtitle badly subtitle one of the Mifune scenes. Send it to all three of us. We need it in our lives. Just
overdub it.
Please,
it'll be really
for the
amazing.
love of God.
When reading a little bit about the preparation for this film, one of the things that's interesting, and maybe my favorite detail is whenever Kurosawa was writing a script, they'd go to a ryokan and get drunk right all day and then get drunk at night. It was like, sounds like the greatest life. And it was 1947, whatever, or 1951, so he can tell his wife, like, I'm leaving for 8 weeks, don't call me. And he just goes and does his thing, which, it makes it clear why he was so productive. He could get away with that stuff. But Mifune was the only person that could come and visit. And originally, the original version of the script was supposed to only be about one samurai, a day in the life of a samurai who commits seppuku at the end of the movie.
And doesn't Galbraith also say it was 500 pages long or something?
Yeah, the first version of it was 500 pages. Yeah. But apparently there were 6 samurai, and they realized they needed like a funny samurai, which is a weird thing to think because the other characters are pretty funny. But apparently Kurosawa said to Mifune, we're writing a Seventh Samurai. You're going to play it. You can do whatever you want. So he just was like, this is it, man. I want you to like grip it and rip it. And the other thing that's really interesting to read is that apparently when he was around Kurosawa, he was a completely different person. He was like quiet and timid and like kind of, and it speaks to the idea that like a lot of the time it seems as though Takashi Shimura's are stand-ins for Kurosawa, and the idea that maybe the relationship between Mifune and Kurosawa is paralleled in the Kikuchi Okambe relationship, which comes back to something you mentioned earlier, which I'd love to talk about in this movie. There's a lot of really interesting older male, younger male relationships in Kurosawa, and I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about the ones in this one, particularly Kikuchio's relationship to Kanbei, especially when we first see Kanbei getting his face shaved and they exchange these looks. For me, it felt very like paternal. There's like a really warm paternal feeling in this movie, especially in those moments, especially with Kanbei.
Yeah, I think it's a really strange relationship, like the father-son relationship, because, or whether it's a mentor to mentee relationship, because I think it goes a couple of ways. It can either go this, you're sort of undercutting them and you're elevating the standard and you're trying to just sort of chip away at this ego to get them to where you want them to go. And then other times it's very nurturing and paternal and you just want to carry them through. And then other times it can be a little bit opaque. And I think that this movie has touches of all of that. And Kurosawa has touches of all of that in his movies in the way that people relate to one another. And I think that I think great leaders, and when you have a great group dynamic, a leader can't act the same way with everyone in the crew. Neil McCauley doesn't act the same way with Chris Shihelis as he does with, say, Michael Torito, because they're different. So I love in this that this is a tender relationship. He can see that this kid wants to learn. And because of that, there's a tenderness and that there's that. And then when he has to be tough with some of the other guys, it makes sense for him to be tough.
And Shimura's character also is fundamentally good. I mean, the first time you see him, he's literally saving a child from a kidnapper. And he is the one. Yeah, there's to the degree to which some of the other samurai might be cynical or kind of jaded or doing this because it obviously is going to result in them getting riches or whatever the case might be, fame. He is generally doing what he's doing and helping the farmers out of the goodness of his heart. And I think that speaks to, again, like the relationship between him and Mifune's character too, in the sense, like, again, it's this kind of nurturing attempt, right? It's this attempt to like show him the ways, like to, bring him up or kind of, I mean, just it's a very humane relationship.
We mentioned the Seven Samurai because we did an episode on our Patreon last month, patreon.com/Uberbusters, on the Dirty Dozen. Always hustling, boys. And it feels
always
to me
be
like
closing, Liam. Always be closing.
Thank you. I can't remember any Glengarry Glen Ross lines. Fuck, I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready.
Just say fuck you. It's all over
Fuck you. Sorry guys, I didn't mean that. I love the scene in Glengarry Glen Ross when Alec Baldwin turns to Jack Lemmon and says she's got a great ass. That's my favorite. That's my favorite moment in Glengarry Glen Ross. Now I lost my train of thought. Damn it. I don't know.
Shimura. Something about the relationship, father son.
It'll come back to me.
George, you and I just start singing.
Happens
and the cats
when the jokes happen. I'm not getting it back. Damn it! Let's jump to the end of the movie. George, in your notes, God, I bet that's going to come back to me, and I'm going to interrupt you. When Kanbei says that they lost the battle and that the real victory belongs to the peasants.
Ooh, deep.
I think this movie. I wonder what this movie reveals about Kurosawa's like class interests, because I feels resonant with some of the other films. What do you think?
I don't think he's. So I will say this again. I don't think it's this reading, let's say, that the peasants or the farmers are the bad guys or anything of that nature. It seems to me that it's just, again, this kind of commentary on human sacrifice and the ways in which oftentimes those sacrifices are not repaid, or that they're impossible to repay. And for me, it's just kind of a nuanced reading, again, of these people. Like, it would be such a shittier film if they were just really simple, naive, innocent farmer folk who didn't, who just needed the samurai to help them, and that there weren't, obviously, to some degree also, self-interest and self-preservation that was necessary for them, and they would kind of do anything to survive. So to me, it was just about the nuance that the story requires in regards to who these people are in relationship to the samurai. And again, I think it's like Kurosawa's commentary on, again, regarding issues of sacrifice, regarding issues of what it is that we owe to one another, how we live in relationship to one another.
Yeah, I mean, this is post-war Japan. So the big thing you got to think about is... And Pauline Kael actually says this phrase in a review, which I love, which is that the Seven Samurai pours all its energies into the extremities of human experience. And so when I think about this movie and when I think about the ways that it's engaging with its past and its history, it's talking about like the peasant class is always the fodder and the place where all of the impacts of warring cultures lie, and split factions of a culture that is now in sort of repair or disarray in post-war after, 2 nuclear attacks. And so I think what's really fascinating is that it's talking about like these guys know they're extinct and they know there's no place for them anymore. And this might be a small victory for them in their minds, but really the Japan that continues to exist is not theirs anymore. It's my reading of it, because it's the same as those, glorious Studio Ghibli movies like My Neighbor Totoro. There's nothing more striking than watching a big giant bear rabbit and 2 little kids and a couple of little other bear rabbits like plant some seeds to a tree and then it exploding like the plume of smoke of a mushroom cloud, like an atom bomb. And I think that's what this movie's doing in a strange way. It's sort of like it's re-examining its own history and its past and this feudal Japan culture through the prism of post-war experience. And it just sort of, he's sort of stamping with that line for me. He's saying, right now, it belongs to the people. We can't maintain this sort of feudal outlook because this is where we are. And it's so amazing to me that there's millions of dollars to spend on a Japanese movie in post-war Japan just to begin with at this time. But, they're doing it, and he's doing it with such grandeur, and it's got such a great statement to say at the end as far as peace and like the extinction of these sort of characters. It also, that's the melancholy, that's the regret. There's nothing more sad about knowing that you're the last ones.
It's interesting.
You're saying he's aware he's the last samurai?
Oh,
see what I did?
That was really good.
A much crappier film, by the way.
Take it easy there, Tom Cruise. It's not a great movie. It's interesting that you bring that up, especially as there's an interesting thing to think about there in terms of what a character like Shimura chooses to do, Kanbei chooses to do, in that he's leaving an era of where he's on top. He's now kind of, maybe he's on a downward trajectory, and the solution is to assemble a group of people who kind of like look to the future. Many of these characters sort of look to the future and smile. Like whenever they talk about the battle, there's a couple of the guys who are like, yeah, well, we might die, right? And then there's the swordsman who's like, well, I'm going to take as many of these assholes out as I possibly can. And then you have the younger generation who are anxious about the future, who don't know what to think. And Shimura as Kanbei is kind of the character who's like, what we have to do is save poor people.
Yes.
We have to save the people who do not have the means to protect themselves. And it feels like a pretty powerful statement about like maybe the older generation in Japan, especially when you consider that the film that follows this one, if I remember correctly, is I Live in Fear, in which Mifune plays an aged patriarch who decides to move his family to Brazil because he's so nervous about nuclear holocaust. So it's almost like maybe these two films on some way are maybe in dialogue with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it past it.
This Kurosawa guy, I think he's got a future.
He knows what he's doing, this kid.
He's got some skills. I remembered what I was going to bring up earlier, which is we talked about the Dirty Dozen. I think there's an interesting corollary between Cassavetes and Mifune, not only as actors, but in characters in those two films, in that they kind of represent the two characters that look at the situation. These are characters that are in groups that are between a rock and a hard place. In the case of Dirty Dozen, it's like we either go blow up some Nazis real good, which sounds great, or we die and we die there, or we die in jail. Whereas Mifune is like, well, we either deal with these terrible peasants and save them and die doing it, or we starve to death. And the fact that they're the ones that reveal this to the groups, they're the truth sayers in those contexts, is kind of interesting. And there's a sort of interesting corollary in the way that I think Mifune plays the part of Kikichio with the tics and the movements and the kind of craziness, especially when you consider the entire oeuvre of John Cassavetes.
Cassavetes is trying to just displace everyone.
Right.
Trying to knock them around in the scene to shake things up.
And that's definitely a Mifune characteristic in this
Big
movie
time.
in
So when
particular.
Cassavetes walks into the sword store, he's like, no, give me a sword bigger than that guy's sword.
I want a bigger sword.
I want a bigger sword.
And then he turns to Seymour Cassell and says she's got a great ass, and it's really good. We will let's wrap it up here. Any last thoughts on the Seven Samurai?
Come on, George.
Well, I was going to
George.
say I was surprised that a movie that has this much math in it was as enjoyable as it was. Because I'm like, the last thing that I want to do while I'm watching a movie is count. Am I right?
Are you referring to when he's crossing the pictures off the...
He's crossing, yeah, he's like 40, got 7. I'm not
dunce.
fucking here to do calculus. I'm here to fucking see some swordplay, right?
I'm trying to...
Yeah, what the fuck?
In fairness, there is a number in the title of the movie, so you guys might be in the wrong
George
there.
is never watching the Ocean's 11 movies.
None of them. No, again.
Wait a minute, they made a 13th and an 8? Math makes no sense.
This film, again, it's been a very long time since I've seen it. I'm so happy that I got a chance to rewatch it again. It's epic. It is...
Is this movie a masterpiece?
It is a masterpiece, of course, Liam. Without question.
Undeniable.
Maybe the first one we've watched.
The first one we've watched?
I'm just kidding. No, it's incredible.
No, but things are relative, right?
Like-
But I think like there's
relative,
certain
yeah.
canonical movies that are
And
undeniably
this is
great.
one of them, yeah.
And it's like
Speak.
Seven Samurai.
Go ahead.
Finished. That's it.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it's nice that it holds up. Like, it's nice that you can watch it and still feel that way. Like, there's certain movies you go back to and you go like, oh yeah, okay, sure, it's good. Like, Maltese Falcon is a movie I rewatched. I'm like, boy, that's a good movie. That's real good. But it doesn't... I think it's really great, but I don't know that I'm like,
some Sam Spade fans, baby.
I love Sam Spade, baby. But I just think at a certain point, I'm like, okay, yep, cool. I get, it's as an example, this movie really holds up more and more every single time.
I feel that way about the Weekend at Bernie's films, in all
Yeah, me
honesty.
too.
Like, I've gone back to them so many times in recent...
You're a dick.
And I'm like, these films, they don't really resonate like the way they did back in the late 90s.
Before George, you're wasting valuable time.
And I just
Blake,
want to say I really loved in The Maltese Falcon when Humphrey Bogart looked at Peter Lorre and said, she's got a great ass.
And he's talking about Sydney Greenstreet. It's a great moment. Blake, before we say goodbye, where you've just crossed the finish line on 101 episodes of All the President's Minutes, correct?
That's right.
A little bit of very quick inside baseball. How do you prep for so many episodes?
So what I do is I watch about 20 minutes of the movie, sometimes 10 minutes of the movie, over and over again for the sequences that I'm preparing for that week. And
In a context. You view it in the context.
Yeah, so what I try and do is not watch the individual minutes. I try and watch a little bit around it. And sometimes certain scenes have like parallel scenes or companion scenes. I've got to go back and revisit those. Especially like a Deep Throat scene, I've got to watch both. The Hugh Sloan scenes, I'm watching both. The Bradley scenes, I'm making an excuse to watch Bradley.
Wow.
And then I try and prepare for each of the individual guests that I'm talking to as well as I've already read All the President's Men like 3 times this year. And so...
Do you sleep?
I do. But probably not as much.
I think you are the hardest working man in podcasting, without question.
Look, I just had Dave Chen on for episode 99, and I would say that if I could be...
He works pretty hard.
Dave Chen's almost as hard as it gets.
He goes hard.
Yeah.
He goes hard. Speaking of going hard, we are going to continue our exploration into the oeuvre of Akira Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune. Next up on the show, I Live in Fear on November 11th. Blake, we can find your work on various platforms. And what's the website is One Heat?
If you just go to oneheatminute.com, you will literally find out everything about all of the shows. And just like you always be closing, go to Patreon/OneHeatMinute. You'll go to an exclusive podcast that happens weekly, as well as news about upcoming projects that we're not sharing yet, and raw and long form unedited interviews that are going to be part of those future projects are going to find a home exclusively on Patreon.
Amazing. Go check that out. Thank you
and
so
we'll put
much,
links
sir.
to all that too, of course.
All of it's going to go in the notes.
Thank you, gents.
Always be hustling. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. www.uberbusters.com. Blake, thank you so much for being here.
Always a pleasure, lads.
Thanks, Blake.
You're the best.
It was awesome.
We'll do it again. I was Liam Billingham.
I was Alain Badu, and I was George Fragopoulos.
He's been there the whole time.
Yeah, he's just been quiet.
And she's got a great ass.
Well, that really fell apart. This was Uber Busters. Thank you.
We made it.
We made it.
Thank you, boys.
All right, Blake, we'll let you
You're the
go.
best.
Thanks, man.
See ya.
Talk soon.